Long before airplanes crisscrossed the skies or cargo ships dotted the oceans, the world was already connected by an invisible web of trade, threads so powerful they could make or break entire civilizations. Picture this, a single bolt of silk, dyed with colors so vibrant they seem to capture the sun itself, traveling from the workshops of China all the way to the bustling markets of Rome. Or spices so precious they were worth their weight in gold, passing through the hands of merchants, nomads, and kings across continents. These weren't just goods, they were the lifeblood of empires, flowing along routes so secretive and strategic that they shaped the course of history itself. What if I told you that the rise and fall of some of the greatest ancient civilizations, from the grandeur of Rome to the splendor of the Khmer Empire, hinged not just on armies or kings, but on these hidden trade networks? These were the secret roads of empire, pathways carved by ambition, necessity, and sometimes sheer luck. They carried more than just silk and spices. They carried ideas, technologies, and even diseases, weaving the world together in ways no one could have imagined. And here's the twist. These networks didn't just build empires, they also broke them. A single disruption in the flow of goods could topple economies, spark wars, or leave entire cities abandoned to the sands of time. So how did these ancient superhighways work, and why do they still matter today? That's the journey we're about to take. From the legendary Silk Road, where caravans braved deserts and bandits, to the amber routes that turned fossilized resin into a symbol of power, we'll follow the footsteps of the traders who changed history. You'll discover how a single trade route could decide the fate of a dynasty, how a handful of peppercorns could buy a man's freedom, and how these networks laid the groundwork for the global economy we know today. This isn't just a story about the past, it's about the hidden connections that still shape our world. So let's step onto these ancient paths together and uncover the secrets they've been whispering for centuries. Imagine a world where your next meal, your tools, even the beads around your neck depended not on what you could make yourself, but on who you knew and how far their connections reached. That was reality for early humans, long before grand empires or bustling marketplaces existed. The very first trade networks began with something as simple as a piece of obsidian, sharp and gleaming, passed from hand to hand. In places like Anatolia, now modern-day Turkey, this volcanic glass traveled hundreds of miles, transformed into knives and arrowheads by skilled hands far from its source. Shells from the coasts found their way inland, traded for flint or food, becoming symbols of status in communities that had never seen the ocean. These weren't just transactions, they were the first whispers of a connected world. But what turned these small exchanges into vast, continent-spanning networks? Necessity played a role. No single village had everything it needed. A settlement rich in salt might trade for grain with a neighbor, while another with access to rare stones could barter for timber. Yet as societies grew, so did their ambitions. Luxury items like lapis lazuli, a blue stone mined only in Afghanistan, began appearing in Mesopotamian tombs over 2,000 miles away. The demand for such treasures pushed trade beyond familiar borders, forging links between distant cultures, and with each new connection, something remarkable happened. Ideas traveled too. Techniques for pottery, metalworking, even writing systems spread along these routes, accelerating innovation in ways no one could have predicted. The real game changer. The rise of middlemen traders who dedicated their lives to moving goods across vast distances. Picture a Bronze Age merchant navigating the deserts of the Middle East, his donkeys laden with tin from Central Asia, a metal crucial for making bronze. Without him, entire civilizations might have stalled for lack of materials. These networks became so vital that protecting them sparked the first trade treaties and even wars. When the Hittites cut off Assyrian access to silver mines, it wasn't just an economic blow, it was a power play that reshaped the ancient Near East. What's astonishing is how these early networks mirror our modern global economy. The same forces that drove a Neolithic farmer to trade obsidian for grain scarcity, desire, opportunity still drive commerce today. Back then, a broken trade route could mean starvation or collapse. Now we call it a supply chain crisis. The scale has changed, but the stakes feel eerily familiar. So the next time you sip coffee from Colombia or type on a phone made with minerals from Congo, remember, you're part of a story that began millennia ago when someone held out a piece of obsidian and said, "What will you give me for this?" The Silk Road wasn't a single path but a sprawling web of trails, like veins carrying lifeblood across the body of Eurasia. Picture a caravan of camels, their backs piled high with bundles of silk, their handlers squinting against the glare of the Taklamakan Desert, a name that translates to place of no return. These traders didn't just brave blistering heat and shifting dunes. They navigated a world where every oasis town was a crossroads of cultures. In Samarkand, Persian merchants haggled over bolts of Chinese silk, while in Chang'an, Roman glassware sat beside Indian spices in bustling markets. The goods were valuable, but the real treasure was what traveled invisibly. A Buddhist monk sketching temple designs on Chinese paper, a Persian scribe learning the secret of ink from a Tang dynasty scholar. What made the Silk Road so resilient wasn't just the demand for luxury goods, it was adaptability. When political turmoil closed one route, like the collapse of the Parthian Empire, merchants simply shifted north through the steppes or south to seaports. The Sogdians, master intermediaries of Central Asia, built entire cities like a relay race, passing goods from one caravan to the next. Their language became the lingua franca of trade, much like English today. And the road's influence was staggering. Buddhism, once confined to India, followed these routes into China, transforming as it traveled. The statue of the giant Buddha at Leshan, carved into a cliff face, owes its existence to those early monks who walked thousands of miles with scriptures strapped to their backs. But the Silk Road also had a dark side. Bandits lurked in the passes of the Pamir Mountains, and warlords demanded exorbitant taxes for protection. The very openness that spread ideas also spread disaster, like the Black Death, which likely hitchhiked from Central Asia to Europe via flea-infested fur traders. And when the Mongols unified the route under Genghis Khan's brutal peace, trade boomed briefly only to collapse as empires fractured and sea routes grew safer. By the time Columbus sailed west, the Silk Road was already fading into legend, its legacy etched not just in goods exchanged but in the DNA of civilizations. The next time you fold a piece of paper or glance at a clock ticking seconds, remember, those innovations might never have reached you without those dusty, daring caravans. While silk glittered in the east, Europe had its own golden treasure: amber, sunlight trapped in stone. This fossilized resin, washed up on Baltic shores, became more valuable than gold in some ancient markets. Roman nobles craved it for jewelry, believing it held healing powers, while Greek physicians ground it into medicines. But getting this golden prize from the misty forests of the north to the sun-drenched villas of the Mediterranean required a network as intricate as the Silk Road, just far less famous. The amber routes weren't marked by grand roads or caravanserais, but by riverbanks and footpaths where traders hauled sacks of raw amber toward waiting Roman ships. What made these routes so extraordinary was their reach. A single piece of amber might pass from the hands of a Baltic hunter-gatherer to a Celtic middleman, then to a Roman merchant who'd ship it to Alexandria, where it could end up adorning an Egyptian queen. Along the way, it wasn't just goods that changed hands. Celtic artisans taught Romans new metalworking techniques, while Germanic tribes adopted Mediterranean motifs in their crafts. Even language shifted. The Latin word for amber, succinum, likely borrowed from the Baltic tongues, but this exchange came at a price. Control over key river crossings, like the Vistula or the Danube, turned into blood-soaked battlegrounds. The Roman Emperor Nero once sent a knight north on a secret mission to secure amber directly, bypassing warring tribes. He returned with enough to decorate an entire gladiatorial arena, proof of how much power lay in controlling the flow of this golden resource. Yet amber's legacy goes beyond trade wars. It preserved history itself. Insects trapped in the resin for millions of years gave medieval scholars their first glimpses of prehistoric life. And when the Roman Empire crumbled, the amber routes didn't vanish, they adapted. Viking traders later used them to funnel northern treasures south, proving that even when empires fell, the lure of rare things kept the world connected. Today, when you see amber in a museum or a jewelry store, you're looking at more than a pretty stone. You're holding a piece of Europe's first economic bloodstream, a network that pulsed with life long before modern maps were drawn. Picture a medieval kitchen where a pinch of pepper could cost a day's wages, or a banquet where cinnamon was displayed like jewels. This wasn't just about taste, it was about power. The spice trade turned tiny seeds and dried bark into the most coveted commodities on earth, shaping the fate of nations. Take black pepper, grown only in India's Malabar coast. By the time it reached Europe, its price had skyrocketed so high that merchants measured it grain by grain, like precious stones. Venetian traders grew fabulously wealthy controlling its overland routes, while Arab middlemen spun tales of pepper guarded by fiery serpents to justify their markups. But the real game-changer came when explorers like Vasco da Gama bypassed these middlemen entirely, sailing around Africa's Cape of Good Hope to reach the source. Overnight, Portugal's fortunes soared, while Venice's dominance crumbled, all because of a humble berry. What made spices so valuable wasn't just their rarity. In an era before refrigeration, they were survival tools. Cloves from Indonesia's Malacca Islands could preserve meat for months, while ginger masked the taste of spoiled food in crowded cities. Apothecaries swore by cardamom for digestion and turmeric for wounds, turning spice cabinets into medicine chests. And then there was the status. Serving nutmeg-studded dishes became a flex of wealth so extreme that English aristocrats carried their own nutmeg graters to dinner parties. The Dutch, obsessed with monopolizing this brown gold, went to horrifying lengths, burning entire nutmeg harvests in the East Indies to keep prices high, and even trading Manhattan to the British in exchange for a tiny spice-rich island called Run. The spice trade's legacy is written in blood and brine. When the Portuguese seized Malacca in 1511, they didn't just claim a port, they broke the Islamic trade network that had dominated Asia for centuries. The Dutch East India Company, history's first multinational corporation, wielded armies and fleets all for control of cinnamon forests in Sri Lanka. These weren't just business ventures, they were empires built on flavor. And the ripple effects were staggering. The search for spices launched Columbus westward, accidentally rewriting world maps. It fueled the slave trade, as plantations demanded labor to meet Europe's insatiable demand. Even today, the ghost of this trade lingers in the saffron fields of Kashmir, where picking the delicate threads remains a painstaking ritual, or in Zanzibar's clove-scented air, a living museum of its spice sultanate past. The next time you sprinkle pepper on your meal, consider this. That tiny shaker holds more than just heat. It's a capsule of human ingenuity, greed, and adventure, a reminder that the pursuit of flavor once tilted the axis of the world. High in the mountains of southern Arabia, where the air shimmers with heat and the earth cracks under the sun, grew trees that wept gold. Frankincense and myrrh, these weren't just resins oozing from gnarled bark, they were the breath of the divine. Ancient Egyptians burned frankincense to carry prayers to the gods, while myrrh anointed everything from pharaohs' tombs to newborn babies. But here's what's fascinating. These sacred scents didn't just symbolize wealth, they created entire economies. Caravans of camels, each beast laden with bulging sacks of resin, trudged 1,500 miles from Oman's Dhofar region to the temples of Jerusalem and the palaces of Rome. A single pound of frankincense could cost a Roman laborer 6 months' wages, making its trade route one of the most lucrative and dangerous in history. The incense route's success hinged on something deeper than economics, belief. In a world where gods felt as real as the wind, these resins were non-negotiable. Temples from Babylon to Athens demanded endless supplies, their altars smoking with fragrant offerings day and night. Myrrh, with its bitter, medicinal scent, became the ancient world's antibiotic used to treat wounds, preserve mummies, even sweeten the breath of nobles at feasts. But the real magic lay in scarcity. Frankincense trees refused to grow anywhere but Arabia's arid highlands, and harvesting the resin was backbreaking work. Slaves carved precise incisions into the bark, waiting weeks for the milky sap to harden into tears, each one graded by color and size like gemstones. Along the route, oasis towns bloomed into metropolises. Petra, carved into rose-red cliffs, grew fat on taxes from passing caravans. The Nabateans, masters of desert trade, built cisterns to hoard water and forts to guard their precious cargo from raiders. They understood something modern businesses still grapple with: control the supply chain and you control the market, yet even their ingenuity couldn't stop the winds of change. When Christianity spread, its simpler rituals needed less incense. Roman tastes shifted toward Indian spices arriving by sea. By the time Islam rose in the 7th century, the once bustling incense route was a ghost road, its treasures buried under dunes. What lingers today isn't just the scent of nostalgia. The frankincense trade teaches us how deeply commerce and faith once intertwined, how a society's gods could dictate its trade routes. Modern perfumers still prize these resins, and archaeologists sift through desert ruins for traces of lost caravans. But perhaps the real lesson is in the fragility of demand. A product prized for millennia can vanish from markets almost overnight when cultures evolve. The next time you catch a whiff of incense in a church or temple, remember, you're breathing in the echoes of an empire built on something as fleeting as smoke. Under a sun so fierce it could bleach bones white, the Sahara stretched like an ocean of sand. Only the bravest dared to cross it. But for those who did, the rewards were beyond imagination. Gold from the mines of West Africa, so pure it dazzled like sunlight itself, traveled north on the backs of camels, while life-preserving salt made the grueling journey south. This wasn't just trade, it was a survival pact between kingdoms separated by the world's largest desert. The rulers of Ghana, sitting atop gold reserves that seemed endless, called themselves Lords of the Gold, while their counterparts in the north craved the precious metal to mint coins that fueled Mediterranean economies. But here's the twist. In the sweltering markets of Timbuktu, salt pried in slabs from the mines of Taghaza, where workers toiled in hellish conditions, could be traded ounce for ounce with gold. Without it, food couldn't be preserved, and survival in the scorching interior was impossible. The real marvel of the Trans-Saharan Trade wasn't just the goods, it was the sheer audacity of the journey. Picture a caravan of 1,000 camels, each beast laden with 400 pounds of cargo, snaking across dunes that could swallow a man in minutes. Guides from the Berber tribes, masters of desert navigation, read the stars and the subtle shifts in wind patterns like a map. They knew where to find hidden wells, their locations guarded more fiercely than treasure. One wrong turn, and entire caravans vanished into the sands, leaving only bleached bones as warnings. Yet the risks were worth it. A single successful round trip could make a merchant richer than a king. Mansa Musa, the legendary ruler of Mali, became the wealthiest man in history by controlling this trade, his famous pilgrimage to Mecca scattering so much gold along the way that it crashed economies for years. But the Sahara gave more than riches, it forged connections that reshaped cultures. In cities like Timbuktu, scholars from across the Islamic world gathered in libraries filled with manuscripts on astronomy, medicine, and law, all funded by trade wealth. The Great Mosque of Djenné, its towering mud brick walls rising from the Niger River floodplain, stood as a testament to the fusion of African and Islamic architecture. Even language transformed, with Arabic script adapting to write local languages like Hausa and Fulani. And then there were the unseen exchanges, the introduction of new crops like cotton and citrus, or the spread of metallurgical techniques that turned West Africa into a hub of iron production. Yet the desert always demanded its due. When Moroccan armies invaded in the 16th century, lured by the legend of Mali's gold, they shattered the delicate balance of power. Trade routes shifted, empires crumbled, and the sands reclaimed oasis towns that had thrived for centuries. Today, the remnants of this network linger in the genetic tapestry of North Africa, in the silver coins minted from Ghana's gold, and in the oral epics still sung about the caravans that dared to conquer the impossible. The next time you sprinkle salt on your food, think of the hands that once weighed it like gold under a desert sky, proof that value is never absolute, only a matter of survival and circumstance. The Indian Ocean wasn't just a body of water. It was a living, breathing marketplace pulsing with the rhythm of monsoon winds. Every year, sailors from East Africa to Indonesia timed their voyages with near mathematical precision, riding the summer winds eastward and the winter winds home. Picture a dhow, how its triangular sail catching the breeze, laden with African ivory bound for Indian workshops, or Chinese porcelain wrapped in palm leaves, destined for a sultan's palace in Zanzibar. This wasn't trade as we know it today. It was a symphony of interdependence where no single empire could dominate, and every player from the Swahili city-states to the Gujarati merchants held a piece of the puzzle. What made this system revolutionary was its lack of central control. Unlike the Silk Road, where empires like Rome or China could exert pressure, the Indian Ocean thrived on cooperation. Arab navigators shared star charts with Malay pilots, while Persian shipbuilders borrowed techniques from Indian craftsmen. Ports like Kilwa and Calicut became melting pots where languages, religions, and culinary traditions blended. A single meal in 15th century Malacca might feature Persian saffron, Javanese peppercorns, and Yemeni coffee, a taste of globalization centuries before container ships. Even money transcended borders. Chinese copper coins circulated in East Africa, while Indian gold pagodas were accepted as far as Sumatra. But the real glue holding this network together was trust. Without formal treaties, merchants relied on kinship ties and reputation. A Tamil trader might leave goods with a Swahili partner, knowing payment would come months later when the winds shifted. This system birthed innovations like the Hawala system, an early form of banking where promises traveled faster than ships, yet fragility lurked beneath the surface. When Portuguese caravels arrived in the late 15th century, cannons trained on harbors, they shattered this delicate balance. Vasco da Gama's brutal capture of Calicut in 1498 wasn't just a military victory, it was the first shot in a war against the ocean's ancient rhythms. The legacy of this trade still echoes in the Creole languages of coastal towns, in the DNA of populations from Madagascar to Sri Lanka, and in the ruins of mosques built with coral stone from distant reefs. The next time you sip a chai latte, a blend of Indian spices, Arab sugar, and British tea culture, remember, you're tasting the ghost of an ocean that refused to be fenced. In the shadow of emperors and kings, it was the middlemen who kept the wheels of ancient commerce turning, often with nothing but their wits and a knack for languages. Take the Sogdians, a people from Central Asia who became the ultimate cultural chameleons. Fluent in Persian, Chinese, and Turkic dialects, they didn't just move goods between empires, they moved ideas. A Sogdian merchant might start his morning haggling over silk prices in a Tang dynasty marketplace, then spend the evening translating Buddhist sutras for a monk from Gandhara. Their letters, preserved in the sands of the Taklamakan, reveal a world where business deals were sealed with poetry, and trust was built over shared meals of roasted lamb and fermented mare's milk. But survival in this high-stakes game required more than charm. Middlemen mastered the art of calculated risk. Phoenician traders, for example, sailed past the Pillars of Hercules, what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar, into the terrifying unknown of the Atlantic. They spread rumors of sea monsters to deter competitors, all while quietly establishing trade posts for tin in Cornwall and purple dye in Morocco. Likewise, the Radhanites, a network of Jewish merchants in the early Middle Ages, turned Europe's chaos into opportunity. When wars between Christians and Muslims made overland routes deadly, they pivoted to a staggering 4,000-mile circuit, buying furs from Vikings, selling them in Baghdad for spices, then trekking back through Egypt to trade those spices for Frankish swords. Their routes looked less like straight lines and more like spiderwebs, adapting to every political tremor. The true genius of these intermediaries lay in their ability to navigate not just geography, but social hierarchies. In the ports of the Indian Ocean, Gujarati brokers known as dalals wore multiple hats: part translator, part matchmaker, part diplomat. They knew which Swahili chief preferred coral beads over porcelain, which Ming official would accept a bribe in silver ingots rather than paper money. Some even became power players in their own right. The Armenian merchant community in New Jolfa, Persia, built a banking system so sophisticated it rivaled the Medicis, using encrypted ledgers and a network of trusted agents from Manila to Amsterdam. Yet their work came with brutal stakes. A single misstep, misjudging a customs official's mood, failing to predict a bandit raid, could mean ruin or death. The graves of countless middlemen lie unmarked along old trade routes, their stories lost to time, but their legacy is etched in the artifacts they ferried across continents. A Byzantine coin found in a Viking hoard, a shard of Song dynasty celadon in a Kenyan dig site. These silent witnesses remind us that globalization didn't begin with satellites and smartphones. It began with a handful of daring individuals who looked at a mountain range or a desert and thought, "There's a way through." Imagine a camel without its saddle, every lurching step sending cargo sliding, the animal's back rubbed raw under the weight. Now picture the moment someone strapped a padded frame onto its hump, transforming agony into efficiency. This wasn't just comfort, it was a revolution. The camel saddle, invented around 500 BCE, turned the ships of the desert into unstoppable freight carriers, capable of hauling 400 pounds across scorching sands for weeks. Suddenly, the Sahara wasn't a barrier but a highway, with caravans moving gold and salt at distances that would have been unthinkable before. but the real genius lay in its simplicity, a design so adaptable that Arab traders added wooden braces to secure heavier loads, while Mongol versions included stirrups for archers to ride and shoot. One innovation, countless ripple effects. Then there was the lateen sail, a triangular marvel that changed the rhythm of the oceans. Unlike square sails that relied on tailwinds, this agile design could catch breezes from the side, even tack against the wind. Arab and Indian sailors mastered it first, their dhows zigzagging across the Indian Ocean with monsoonal precision. When the Portuguese adopted it in the 15th century, combining it with sturdier hulls, they unlocked the ability to sail anywhere, anytime. The result, Vasco da Gama's fleet rounding the Cape of Good Hope, wasn't just navigation. It was the climax of centuries of incremental innovation. But technology wasn't always about grand inventions. Sometimes progress hid in something as mundane as a set of weights. In the bazaars of ancient Babylon, traders relied on standardized shekels, carefully carved stones that ensured no merchant could cheat by tilting the scale. The Indus Valley civilization took it further, creating uniform cubit rods for measuring cloth, while Chinese officials minted coins with exact weights to prevent shaving. These weren't just tools, they were the foundation of trust. A Phoenician merchant in Carthage knew that a shekel of silver in Tyre would buy the same amount of grain back home, smoothing transactions across thousands of miles. The most surprising breakthroughs often emerged from collision points between cultures. Take the astrolabe, a Greek invention perfected by Islamic scholars. By calculating the angle of stars, it let sailors navigate open waters far beyond sight of land. Muslim traders carried it to West Africa, where it guided camel caravans by night, while Viking explorers adapted similar tools to cross the North Atlantic. Even disease played a role. The stirrup, vital for mounted warfare, may have spread rapidly during the Huns' invasions, proving that technology could ride the coattails of chaos. What ties these innovations together is their power to shrink the world. A saddle turned deserts into trade routes, a sail tamed the seas, and a weighted scale built economies of trust. Behind every bolt of silk or sack of pepper was a story of human ingenuity, not just in the goods traded, but in the invisible systems that made trading possible. The next time you see a cargo ship glide into port or tap a digital payment into your phone, remember, you're witnessing the latest chapter in an ancient saga of problem solving that began with a camel's sore back and a trader's clever fix. Long before the clink of coins or the rustle of banknotes, trade ran on something far more personal. The weight of a sack of grain, the gleam of a copper ingot, the smoothness of a cowrie shell passed from palm to palm. In ancient Mesopotamia, merchants didn't count coins, they measured barley in shekels, a unit so ingrained in society that it became both a weight and a currency. Over in the Andes, woven cloth called compi held such value that Incan bureaucrats used it to calculate taxes, while in West Africa, tiny bronze bracelets known as manillas were stacked like cash in market stalls. These weren't just objects, they were promises, tangible proof that one person's labor could be exchanged for another's. But barter had its limits. What if a potter needed meat but the butcher didn't want ceramics? Enter commodity money items with intrinsic worth that everyone agreed to treat as currency. Salt bricks in Ethiopia could preserve food and buy livestock. In Mesoamerica, cacao beans were so prized that Aztec counterfeiters filled empty bean husks with dirt. And then there's silk. In Han Dynasty China, bolts of it became so trusted that soldiers were paid in fabric, turning battle victories into wearable wealth. The brilliance of these systems lay in their flexibility. A Yepes islander in Micronesia might never move his limestone rye currency. Some discs weighed as much as cars, but everyone knew who owned which stone, making trade possible without physical exchange. Then came the Lydians. Around 600 BC, this Anatolian kingdom did something revolutionary. They stamped lumps of electrum, a gold-silver alloy, with symbols to guarantee weight and purity. These first coins were more than convenient. They were tiny pieces of propaganda. The lion's head etched on each one declared the king's authority, turning every transaction into a reminder of state power. The idea spread like wildfire. Greek city-states minted coins with gods and heroes, while Roman denarii bore the faces of emperors, turning pockets into miniature galleries of political messaging. Yet not every society embraced coins. The Mongol Empire, despite its vast trade networks, often preferred silk or silver by weight, a system so fluid that Marco Polo marveled at how merchants accepted torn fabric scraps as long as they bore the imperial seal. In medieval Japan, rice remained the ultimate measure of wealth, with samurai stipends calculated in koku, the amount needed to feed one person for a year. These choices weren't random, they reflected deeper values. Where coins thrived, so did centralized governments and armies paid in standardized wages. Where commodity money persisted, local ecosystems and traditions held sway. The real unsung hero of ancient finance, trust, from Mesopotamian clay tablets recording beer debts to the Hawala networks of Arab traders who moved wealth across continents with handwritten notes, credit systems allowed economies to flourish even when hard currency was scarce. In medieval Europe, a merchant could deposit silver in Bruges and withdraw its value in Venice using a bill of exchange, a paper promise that foreshadowed modern banking. This invisible web of IOUs proved that money wasn't just about metal or shells. It was about the collective belief that a promise today would hold value tomorrow. So the next time you tap your phone to pay for coffee, remember, you're part of a story that began with barley and bronze, a saga where every society devised its own answer to one universal question: how do we measure what we owe each other? Whether stamped with a lion's head or woven into cloth, currency has always been more than money. It's a fingerprint of human ingenuity pressed into the clay of history. The shimmering cargo that made trade routes so lucrative: silver from Spain, spices from the Moluccas, silk from China, also painted a target on every merchant's back. Along the winding mountain passes of the Silk Road, bandits lurked like wolves, studying caravan schedules and bribing guards for information. At sea, pirates watched for the telltale silhouette of a heavy-laden dhow wallowing low in the water. These weren't just common thieves, they were sophisticated operators who understood the rhythms of commerce better than most merchants. Take the notorious Cilician pirates of the Mediterranean, who didn't just raid ships. They ran sprawling black markets on hidden coasts, complete with auction houses for stolen goods and scribes to record transactions. When Rome finally crushed them in 67 BC, the markets of Delos were flooded with so much looted inventory that prices plummeted across the empire. What made these raiders so formidable was their intimate knowledge of trade's weak points. On land, bandits like the Central Asian Karakas timed their attacks for the hour before dawn, when caravan guards were bleary-eyed and camels were too laden to flee quickly. At sea, pirates from the South China Sea to the Caribbean exploited predictable monsoon winds and choke points like the Straits of Malacca, where ships had no choice but to sail within arrow range of jungle-covered shores. Some even played the long game. The Vikings didn't just pillage, they posed as traders to study defenses before striking. A Norse trader might spend weeks drinking with Frankish merchants, memorizing which warehouses held the richest furs or silver, only to return later with 50 oarsmen and axes. Empires fought back with brutal creativity. The Han dynasty strung signal fires along the Great Wall to warn of bandit raids, while the Byzantines deployed Drummond's fast warships with flamethrowers that could outmaneuver pirate galleys. The most effective deterrent, though, was psychological. Carthage crucified pirates along busy shipping lanes as a grisly warning, while the Moguls displayed bandit heads on spikes at every caravanserai. Yet these measures often backfired. When Rome's executions made the Cilicians desperate, they escalated to kidnapping aristocrats like Julius Caesar himself, who, legend says, amused himself by composing poetry while awaiting ransom. The line between trader and raider was often blurrier than history admits. Many so-called pirates began as legitimate merchants pushed to desperation by unfair tariffs or confiscated cargo. The Barbary corsairs of North Africa saw themselves as holy warriors reclaiming wealth from Christian ships, just as Elizabethan privateers like Francis Drake considered Spanish galleons fair game. Even empires played both sides. The Ming dynasty alternately licensed and hunted down the Waku pirates depending on whether they needed foreign goods or political stability. What's rarely acknowledged is how piracy and banditry inadvertently fueled innovation. The need to protect goods gave us the first marine insurance policies in 14th century Genoa, where bankers pooled risk across voyages. Caravanserais evolved into fortresses with watchtowers and hidden cellars, while the Hanseatic League's contour trading posts doubled as armed compounds. The very concept of diplomatic immunity emerged from the wreckage of pirate attacks, as merchants demanded safe passage guarantees sealed by kings, perhaps the greatest irony. Some of history's most feared raiders became its most celebrated traders. The Vikings who terrorized Europe's coasts eventually established peaceful commerce hubs from Dublin to Novgorod. The Bugis sailors of Indonesia, once infamous for their raids, transformed into the region's most trusted spice brokers. Even today, the descendants of Caribbean pirates run legitimate shipping companies in Nassau, proof that the shadow economy has always been trade's dark twin, shaping the world as surely as any honest merchant's ledger. The same trade routes that carried silk and spices also carried something far deadlier: invisible passengers that could decimate entire civilizations. When Mongol armies laid siege to the Genos trading post of Kaffa in 1346, they didn't just bring arrows and siege engines. They brought plague-infested fleas hidden in grain sacks and fur pelts. As terrified merchants fled by ship, they unwittingly turned the Black Death into history's first documented case of biological warfare. Within months, the disease erupted in Mediterranean ports, then raced along trade routes like fire through dry grass. By the time it subsided, nearly half of Europe's population lay buried in mass graves. This wasn't just a health crisis, it was globalization's dark mirror, revealing how tightly the world was already connected for better and worse. Ancient societies grappled with these outbreaks in ways that feel eerily familiar. In Constantinople, Emperor Justinian imposed quarantines during the 6th century plague of Justinian, ordering guards to seal off infected neighborhoods. Chinese physicians during the Han Dynasty prescribed smoke inhalation and herbal remedies for pestilential air, while Islamic scholars like Ibn Sina pioneered the concept of isolating the sick in specialized hospitals. But the most striking responses came from ordinary people. Venetian health boards invented the 40-day isolation period quarantina to screen incoming ships, while rural communities from England to Persia developed plague stones, flat rocks where traders could leave goods in vinegar baths for disinfection before exchanging coins placed in bowls of vinegar. These weren't just medical measures, they were acts of collective ingenuity in the face of terror. The economic aftershocks were just as devastating. When the Black Death wiped out a third of Asia's and Europe's workforce, labor suddenly became valuable. Serfs demanded wages for the first time, toppling feudalism's rigid hierarchies. In Cairo, the price of a skilled carpenter soared 600% overnight, while in Florence, the sudden scarcity of workers fueled the artistic innovations of the Renaissance. Yet the toll wasn't evenly distributed. Port cities like Bristol and Marseille never fully recovered their trade dominance, while inland hubs like Nuremberg thrived by shifting to plague-resistant industries like clockmaking. The lesson trade networks giveth, and they taketh away often in the same breath. Perhaps the most haunting legacy lies in the cultural scars. The danse macabre paintings that swept medieval Europe, showing skeletons leading emperors and peasants alike to the grave, weren't just art, they were trauma responses. In the Islamic world, the plague fueled theological debates about predestination, while in China, the collapse of the Yuan dynasty was blamed on heaven's displeasure with Mongol rule. Yet amid the despair, trade routes also became lifelines for recovery. Jewish physicians expelled from France found refuge in Ottoman lands, bringing medical knowledge that saved countless lives. Italian merchants revived the silk trade by teaching plague-emptied towns how to cultivate mulberry trees. Even in ruin, the threads of connection persisted. Today, as we navigate our own era of global pandemics, these ancient struggles hold sobering lessons. The same ships that brought tea and porcelain to London in the 1800s also carried cholera from Bengal. The railroads that opened the American West shuttled smallpox into indigenous communities. Connectivity has always been a package deal, prosperity and peril woven together. But history also offers hope. Just as the quarantines of Venice or the sanitation laws of Baghdad slowed disease's march, our ancestors proved that human adaptability can outpace even the deadliest stowaways. The question isn't whether trade will continue to spread risks, but whether we can match their resilience when the next invisible traveler comes calling. A Buddhist monk standing before a Greek statue of Hercules might seem like a scene out of time until you realize it happened. In the 2nd century BCE, the Greco-Bactrian kingdom of Central Asia produced coins stamped with Zeus on one side and the Buddha on the other. This wasn't just artistic whimsy, it was the birth of Gandharan art, where Greek sculptors carved flowing drapery onto Buddha's robes, blending Mediterranean realism with Asian spirituality. Meanwhile, thousands of miles west, Arabic numerals originally developed in India were quietly revolutionizing European mathematics, replacing clunky Roman numerals with the elegant zero. A concept so radical it was once banned by Florentine merchants as the devil's digit. These weren't mere curiosities, they were proof that trade routes carried something far more transformative than spices or silk, the DNA of cultures themselves. Language tells the same story. Walk through the spice markets of Zanzibar today and you'll hear Swahili, a tongue woven from Bantu roots, Arabic loanwords, and Portuguese terms like mesa table and jareza jail, remnants of colonial encounters. Along the Silk Road, Sogdian merchants acted as linguistic bridges, their contracts scribbled in scripts borrowing from Syriac, Persian, and Chinese. Even faiths traveled these highways. Nestorian Christianity, born in Syria, found converts in Tang Dynasty China, while Sufi Islam rode into Southeast Asia on the sails of Gujarati traders, merging with local animism to create entirely new spiritual traditions. The Javanese Wayang shadow puppets, once used to tell Hindu epics, later adapted to spread Islamic teachings, proof that culture doesn't replace, it layers. Yet blending was never bloodless. When Buddhist missionaries carried their faith into Tibet, they clashed with Bon shamans over sacred mountains and rituals. In Mesoamerica, Spanish friars smashed Aztec temples but quietly absorbed indigenous corn gods into Catholic saint cults. The most violent collisions often revolved around food. like the Islamic prohibition on pork colliding with the pig-rearing traditions of medieval Spain, or Hindu vegetarianism straining against the meat-heavy diets of Central Asian Turkic traders. Even fashion sparked tension. When Chinese elites adopted Central Asian trousers for horseback riding, Confucian scholars decried them as barbaric, while in Rome, senators railed against silk as morally corrupting for being half-naked fabric. What's astonishing is how these ancient frictions birthed enduring syntheses. The blue and white porcelain coveted by Ming emperors, its cobalt came from Persia, its technique from China, and its floral motifs from Islamic art, a masterpiece of borrowed beauty. The grand bazaars of Istanbul still echo with the Bedestan system, where Armenian jewelers, Jewish moneylenders, and Arab spice sellers operated under Ottoman laws blending Turkic, Byzantine, and Sharia traditions. Even today, your morning coffee ritual ties back to Ethiopian Sufi monks who drank it for night prayers, Yemeni traders who monopolized its export, and Venetian merchants who rebranded it as a European salon drink. The real lesson isn't just that cultures influence each other, it's that they're fundamentally remade in the process. No civilization emerges in isolation. They're all patchworks of borrowed brilliance and negotiated differences. So when you scroll through social media, typing Hindi-derived words like shampoo or pajamas on a device powered by Arabic algebra, remember, you're not just using tools from around the world. You're living proof that trade's greatest commodity was never goods. It was the irreversible, glorious mess of human connection. Rome's legions didn't just march on steel and discipline, they marched on grain. The empire's lifeline stretched from the wheat fields of Egypt to the docks of Ostia, where shiploads of North African grain kept the capital's million citizens fed. Lose that supply chain, and the streets would erupt in riots. That's why Rome didn't just conquer territories, it conquered trade routes. When Pompey cleared Mediterranean pirates in 67 BC, it wasn't just for glory. It was to secure the sea lanes that brought Spanish silver to mint coins and Syrian timber to build fleets. Even their roads, those iconic straight ribbons of stone, were trade arteries first, military highways second. A merchant could travel from Londinium to Jerusalem without ever leaving Roman paved safety, paying customs at way stations that doubled as surveillance posts. The empire's genius, turning commerce into control, taxing every amphora of olive oil and ingot of British tin to fund the very armies that protected those shipments. Yet no empire mastered the art of trade as power like the Mongols. Under Genghis Khan, they didn't just conquer the Silk Road, they weaponized it. Where others saw deserts and mountains, the Mongols saw a vast postal system. Their Yam network of relay stations, spaced a day's ride apart, let merchants and messengers cross 6,000 miles in weeks, not months. Safe passage was guaranteed by a simple rule: harm a trader, and your entire village would vanish under hooves. This wasn't altruism, it was cold calculation. Mongol Khans taxed trade at 5%, a bargain compared to the Byzantine Empire's 25%. The result? A 13th century economic boom where Persian carpets reached Korea and Venetian glass appeared in Beijing. Even their conquests were trade deals by other means. When a city surrendered without resistance, its merchants got tax breaks. Resistance meant annihilation, a lesson learned brutally by the Khwarezmian Empire, whose decision to execute Mongol envoys led to the destruction of every river port along the Oxus. The Mauryan Empire in India took a different approach. Emperor Ashoka didn't just build roads, he planted mango groves along them, offering shade and fruit to weary travelers. His rock edicts, carved at trade crossroads, didn't boast of battles but listed the price controls on goods like ivory and cotton, the Mauryan secret. Soft power, by standardizing weights and digging wells along caravan routes, they made their territory the safest bet for merchants crossing the subcontinent. When Ashoka converted to Buddhism, he sent missionaries not with swords but with medicinal herbs and knowledge of irrigation, trade sweeteners that opened doors from Sri Lanka to Syria. But dominance always had an expiration date. Rome's reliance on Egyptian grain left it vulnerable when climate change dried up the Nile floods in the 3rd century. The Mongols' tolerance fractured into civil war when rival Khans began taxing the same camel twice, and the Mauryaans, their carefully nurtured routes, collapsed when internal rebellions disrupted the flow of Ganges River traffic. The pattern was universal. Empires rose by mastering trade's flow and fell when they lost their grip on its pulse. What's startling is how these ancient strategies echo today. Modern nations still fight over shipping lanes and pipelines, still use tariffs as both weapon and shield. The difference, where Rome had grain fleets and the Mongols had horse relays, we have container ships and fiber optic cables. The game hasn't changed, only the playing field. Even the mightiest trade networks weren't immune to collapse, often undone by forces as unpredictable as the weather. Take the Akkadian Empire, which dominated Mesopotamia's copper trade until a 300-year drought turned its heartland to dust around 2200 BCE. Tree rings from ancient cedar forests tell the story. Years of failing rains, crops withering in the fields, and caravans stranded without water. The empire that once fed thousands on Sumerian grain watched its trade partners vanish like mirages in the heat. But climate wasn't the only culprit. When Rome's eastern provinces splintered into warring states in the 3rd century CE, the Incense route crumbled not from lack of demand, but because no single power could guarantee safe passage through the desert anymore. Bandits picked off caravans, oasis towns dried up without imperial maintenance, and suddenly, frankincense that had flowed for millennia became a luxury even temples couldn't afford. Political upheaval could unravel trade networks almost overnight. The Mongol Empire's Pax Mongolica had made the Silk Road safer than ever, until the Black Death and Civil War shattered that unity. By 1368, when the Ming dynasty rose in China, its emperors saw foreign trade as a threat rather than an opportunity. They banned private ocean voyages, dismantled shipyards, and turned inward, leaving Silk Road cities like Samarkand to wither like grapes on a severed vine. Half a world away, the Maya faced a similar reckoning. Their jade and obsidian trade, which had connected cities across Mesoamerica, collapsed when warfare between Tikal and Calakmul disrupted overland routes. With no pack animals or wheeled carts, each broken alliance meant another artery of commerce cut off, until the grand plazas where merchants once haggled under woven awnings stood silent beneath the jungle canopy. Sometimes collapse came not from violence or drought, but from sheer economic irrelevance. The amber routes that had made Baltic tribes wealthy faltered when crusaders brought back Middle Eastern resins as holy souvenirs, undercutting demand. Venetian glassmakers learned to mimic the clarity of Chinese porcelain, reducing Europe's reliance on fragile overland shipments. And when Portuguese caravels began sailing directly to the Spice Islands in the 16th century, the centuries-old overland spice markets of Aleppo and Damascus became ghost towns almost overnight. The lesson: trade routes don't just die from lack of goods, they die when someone finds a cheaper, faster, or safer way to move them. Yet the most insidious collapses were the slow ones, the death by 1,000 cuts. The Trans-Saharan Trade didn't vanish in a single catastrophe. It bled out over centuries as European ships began sailing down Africa's west coast, offering textiles and guns in exchange for gold and slaves directly at the source. Each diverted caravan meant less wealth for Timbuktu's scholars, fewer repairs for desert wells, and eventually, a silence where once there had been the rhythmic bells of salt-laden camels. Similarly, the Indian Ocean's peaceful trade web didn't so much collapse as get hijacked first by Portuguese cannons, then by Dutch monopolies, until the old system of trust and kinship between Arab, Indian, and Malay traders was replaced by the cold calculus of colonial ledgers. What makes these collapses so haunting is how familiar their warning signs feel today. A modern shipping lane blocked by geopolitical tensions isn't so different from the Hittites cutting off Assyria's tin supply. A pandemic disrupting global supply chains echoes the plague-ridden ships fleeing Kaffa. Even climate change, with its melting Arctic ice opening new trade routes while drowning ancient ports, mirrors the droughts that doomed the Akkadians. The through line is clear. Civilizations that treat trade networks as indestructible often learn too late how fragile those threads really are. Yet history also offers hope, like the Phoenicians who survived the Bronze Age collapse by pivoting from copper to purple dye, or the Swahili cities that outlasted Portuguese raids by trading ivory instead of gold. Collapse isn't always the end. Sometimes it's just the painful birth of something new. When Carthage and Rome clashed in the Punic Wars, the real prize wasn't just territory, it was the Mediterranean's trade arteries. Carthaginian merchants had dominated the sea lanes for centuries, their ships laden with Spanish silver, African ivory, and Sicilian grain. Rome, initially a land power, recognized that to truly dominate, it needed to control the waves. The moment they reverse-engineered a captured Carthaginian warship and built their own fleet, the balance of power shifted forever. Victory didn't just mean annexing land, it meant seizing the docks of Carthage, where tariffs had once funded armies capable of challenging Rome itself. By the time they salted the earth of Carthage in 146 BC, Rome wasn't just erasing a rival, it was monopolizing the flow of goods from Spain to Egypt. Centuries later, the same drama played out in the Indian Ocean, but with spices instead of silver. When Portugal's Vasco da Gama arrived in Calicut in 1498, he didn't just bring ships, he brought cannons. The Zamorin of Calicut, accustomed to peaceful trade with Arab and Gujarati merchants, balked at Portuguese demands for exclusive rights to the pepper trade. What followed was a century of naval sieges and burned harbors, as Portugal tried to muscle its way into a system built on trust and reciprocity. The irony. Their brutality backfired. By alienating local rulers, they pushed spices onto alternative routes through the Red Sea, enriching their Ottoman enemies instead. The Opium Wars of the 19th century revealed a darker twist in the marriage of trade and conflict. Britain, desperate to balance its tea imports from China, flooded the country with opium from Bengal. When the Qing dynasty resisted, destroying chests of the drug in Canton, British gunboats retaliated with overwhelming force. The resulting treaties didn't just open Chinese ports, they handed control of customs duties to foreign powers, crippling the king's ability to fund modernization. This wasn't warfare for territorial gain, it was warfare for economic subjugation, setting a precedent that would haunt global trade for generations. Yet trade wars weren't always about brute force. The Hanseatic League, a network of medieval German merchants, wielded economic sanctions like a scalpel. When Bruges imprisoned Hanse traders in 1358, the League simply rerouted all shipping to rival ports, starving the city of grain and timber until it capitulated. Their power grew so immense that kings borrowed from their coffers, and their trading posts in Novgorod and London operated as semi-independent states. The lesson: when commerce is your weapon, blockades can be as effective as battalions. What unites these conflicts is their lasting fingerprints on the modern world. The Punic Wars cemented Rome's template of conquest then, trade. a model European empires would mimic for millennia. Portugal's failed spice monopoly revealed the limits of coercion in global commerce, while the Opium Wars exposed how trade could be weaponized to enforce inequality. Even the Hanseatic League's decline, spurred by Dutch and English competitors bypassing their middlemen, foreshadowed today's disruptions, where digital platforms render old gatekeepers obsolete. The next time you read about tariffs or sanctions, remember, these aren't just policy tools. They're the latest skirmishes in a war as old as civilization itself, the battle to control the invisible threads that bind the world together. History books love to paint ancient trade as a man's world, full of bearded merchants haggling in dusty bazaars and ship captains braving stormy seas. But scratch beneath the surface, and you'll find women everywhere, weaving the silk that built empires, brewing the beer that lubricated deals, and even commanding fleets that crossed oceans. Take the Phoenician port city of Tyre, where temple records show women running textile workshops that exported purple dye, the same royal pigment that made Tyre fabulously wealthy. These weren't just anonymous workers. Some signed contracts with their own seals, like one woman named Eshmun Amat, who appears in tablets as both a lender and a borrower of silver. While men dominated long-distance voyages, women often controlled local production networks, turning homes into factories where children spun thread while mothers negotiated prices with traveling merchants. In West Africa, market women were the backbone of regional trade. Among the Igbo, the Amu, a queen of the marketplace, held veto power over disputes and set prices on everything from yams to copper bracelets. Her authority was so absolute that European traders in the 16th century wrote home in frustration about having to appease the old women who rule the stalls. Meanwhile, in the Swahili city-states, elite women like Fatima bint Mbarak al-Nabahani used their kinship ties to broker deals between Arab dhow captains and African ivory hunters, amassing fortunes that funded coral stone mansions and Quranic schools. Their influence was so pervasive that Portuguese invaders complained of petticoat governments undermining their control. Some women didn't just participate in trade, they weaponized it. The legendary Queen of Sheba didn't just visit King Solomon with camels laden with spices. She likely controlled the incense routes that made her kingdom rich. Centuries later, the Candake queens of Mara taxed Roman merchants into oblivion for the privilege of accessing Nubian gold, while Byzantine Empress Theodora, once a wool spinner's daughter, used her understanding of the silk trade to break Persia's monopoly by smuggling silkworms in hollow walking sticks. Even in the male-dominated Mongol Empire, women like Sorgatoni managed vast trading networks across the steppes, ensuring their sons, including Kublai Khan, inherited not just armies but economic empires. The erasure of these women wasn't accidental. Medieval Arab geographers often dismissed market women as gossips, while European guild records minimized female apprentices as helpers. When the Spanish arrived in Mesoamerica, they were baffled to find Aztec women like the Pochteca merchants conducting long-distance trade, and promptly relegated them to domestic roles in colonial accounts. Yet the evidence survives in unexpected places. Clay tablets from Assyria list women as creditors in long-distance tin deals, while tax rolls from medieval France reveal widows inheriting and expanding their husbands' trading companies. Even the humble loom tells a story. The finest Viking-age textiles found in Dublin's excavations were likely woven by women whose names we'll never know, but whose work clothed empires. What's remarkable isn't just that women traded, but how they reshaped commerce itself. In ancient Anatolia, Hittite women inserted clauses into contracts guaranteeing they could keep their profits separate from their husbands' debts. Ming Dynasty business manuals advised merchants to listen to the wife's calculations when pricing goods, while Renaissance Venice's court records overflow with lawsuits filed by women demanding unpaid invoices. From the beer-brewing priestesses of Sumer to the Nubian queens who taxed Rome's gold lust, women didn't just play the game, they wrote its hidden rules. The next time you picture a bustling ancient marketplace, don't just see the men shouting prices. Listen for the women whispering deals behind their sleeves, weighing silver in hidden courtyards, and stitching the very fabric of history itself. The same trade routes that carried silk and spices also carried people in chains, a grim reality woven into the fabric of ancient commerce. Roman estates called latifundia sprawled across the Mediterranean, their fields worked by enslaved laborers who harvested olives and grapes for export. These weren't just prisoners of war, they were investments bought and sold in bustling slave markets like Delos, where dealers boasted they could move 10,000 people in a single day. The scale was staggering. By the 1st century BCE, some estimates suggest enslaved individuals made up a third of Italy's population, their labor fueling the wine and oil trade that enriched patrician elites. Yet their hands never touched the gold those amphorae earned wealth built on their backs while they slept on dirt floors. Across the Sahara, the trade took on a different shape but the same brutality. Arab merchants called the enslaved abid, meaning those who serve, but the records from Timbuktu's archives reveal a harsher truth. Caravans transported not just salt and gold but human beings, marching them across blistering sands to markets in Cairo and Damascus. The Zanj rebellion of the 9th century, led by enslaved East Africans in Iraq's salt marshes, exposed the system's fragility. For 15 years, rebels burned ports and disrupted trade, proving even the most oppressed could strike at the heart of empire. Their uprising wasn't just a fight for freedom, it was a direct attack on the economic machinery that demanded their bodies as fuel. Justifications for these systems were as varied as they were chilling. Aristotle claimed some people were natural slaves, a theory Roman jurists later codified into law. Islamic scholars debated whether enslaving non-Muslims was a means of spreading faith, while Viking sagas framed captivity as the inevitable fate of the weak. Yet resistance persisted in quiet acts of defiance. The runaways who vanished into Appalachian forests, the Berber guides who misplaced slave caravans in the desert, the songs sung in Congo mines that preserved maps to freedom. Even language carried rebellion. The Swahili word utani, meaning playful teasing, originally described the coded insults enslaved people used to mock their captors. The moral contradictions were stark. The same Phoenician traders who pioneered maritime insurance would drown sick enslaved people to avoid port fees. The Han Dynasty, which banned the enslavement of ethnic Chinese, eagerly purchased Central Asian captives for their frontier garrisons. And in the Americas, Mayan nobles who decried Spanish brutality had themselves kept war captives as weavers and builders. This wasn't just hypocrisy, it was the collision of profit and morality, a tension that still echoes in today's debates over sweatshops and trafficking. What's often overlooked is how slavery itself became a commodity chain. A single enslaved person in Rome might pass through Greek middlemen, Celtic raiders, and Black Sea dealers before reaching the auction block. In East Africa, captives were processed through Zanzibar's holding pens, where they were fattened and baptized to raise their market value. The paperwork was meticulous. Bills of sale from Venice to Baghdad specified teeth, scars, and skills, reducing lives to inventory lines. Yet even here, humanity flickered. Archaeologists at Pompeii found a bakery where enslaved workers left fingerprints in the dough, while letters from a Roman farm plead for a child not to be sold apart from their mother. Confronting this history isn't just about tallying horrors, it's about recognizing how deeply coercion shaped the ancient world's prosperity. The silver that paid Athenian sailors came from Laurian's mines, where enslaved laborers choked on tunnel dust. The sugar medieval Europeans craved was pressed by enslaved crews on Cypriot plantations, and when we admire Rome's aqueducts or Samarkand's mosaics, we're seeing art built on unseen suffering. The lesson isn't that trade was inherently evil, but that its brightest golden ages often cast the darkest shadows. The lush cedar forests of Lebanon once stretched for miles, their aromatic wood prized by pharaohs for temple beams and by Phoenicians for ship masts. But as demand soared, the axes swung faster. Egypt's insatiable need for funerary barges and Rome's obsession with cedar-roofed villas stripped entire mountainsides bare. By the 1st century CE, the historian Pliny the Elder lamented that Lebanon's slopes stood naked and shivering, a warning etched in tree rings that tell of soil erosion so severe it silted up Mediterranean ports. This wasn't just deforestation, it was an ecological domino effect. Without tree roots to anchor the earth, rains washed fertile topsoil into rivers, choking fish populations that coastal communities relied on. The very trade that brought wealth also unraveled the environment that sustained it. Exotic animals paid an even steeper price. Roman emperors, eager to impress crowds in the Colosseum, emptied North Africa of elephants and Libya of lions. Shipping manifests from Alexandria reveal grim math. For every lion that survived the voyage to Rome, 3 died in transit, stacked in cramped holds without water or air. The Caspian tiger vanished entirely, hunted to extinction for Persian royal hunts and Chinese medicinal trade. Even seemingly sustainable trades like the Mediterranean purple dye industry collapsed under its own success. Harvesting a single ounce of Tyrian purple required crushing thousands of murex snails, their breeding grounds so depleted that by the 4th century CE, the color became too expensive even for emperors. Some ancient societies did push back. The Mauryan Emperor Ashoka's edicts from the 3rd century BCE mandated shade trees along roads and protected forests near villages, while Qin dynasty laws punished illegal timber cutting with forced labor on the Great Wall. The Maya practiced crop rotation in their cacao groves, letting fields lie fallow to prevent soil exhaustion, a wisdom lost when Spanish colonists demanded maximum yields at any cost. Perhaps most strikingly, the Norse settlers of Greenland starved rather than overhunt walrus populations they'd already decimated. Their bones found centuries later beside carefully stacked tusks they refused to take. The parallels to modern crises are impossible to ignore. Just as Roman lead mining poisoned aqueducts with runoff, today's lithium extraction for batteries threatens desert water tables. The Sahara's expansion, accelerated by ancient overgrazing along trade routes, mirrors contemporary desertification from industrial agriculture. Even concepts like peak wood in Bronze Age Mesopotamia find echoes in our own debates over peak oil. What's haunting isn't just that our ancestors faced these problems, but how often their solutions, like the terraced farms of the Inca or the water-saving qanats of Persia, were abandoned in the rush for short-term profit. Yet ancient trade's environmental legacy isn't solely one of destruction. The same routes that spread deforestation also carried the seeds of resilience. Date palms from Mesopotamia took root in North Africa, while drought-resistant millet traveled from China to sustain African communities during dry spells. The lesson isn't that trade itself was the enemy, but that unbridled demand always outpaces nature's ability to heal. When we walk through a Lebanese cedar reserve today, seeing saplings planted where giants once stood, we're witnessing a truth our ancestors learned too late. Civilizations thrive not by conquering their environment, but by listening to its whispers before they become screams. Long before GPS or insurance contracts, traders braved the unknown with little more than stars and stories to guide them. And oh, what stories they told. Take Sinbad the Sailor, that legendary Persian merchant whose 7 voyages mixed equal parts commerce and catastrophe. Each tale follows the same rhythm, a ship laden with riches, a storm or monster that scatters it all, and a desperate scramble to turn disaster into profit. When Sinbad escapes a giant rock by tying himself to its leg, only to discover a valley carpeted in diamonds, it's not just adventure, it's a metaphor for trade's high-stakes gamble. The real magic lies in what these stories leave out. No mention of tariffs or middlemen, just the raw thrill of risk and reward, where a single clever move could transform shipwrecked beggars into kings. The Greeks, too, wove trade into their foundational myths. Jason's quest for the Golden Fleece wasn't just heroism, it was a thinly veiled trade mission for Colchi's most valuable export, fleeces used to filter gold dust from mountain streams. When Medea helps Jason steal it, she's not just a love-struck sorceress, she's the original corporate spy, leaking proprietary technology to a foreign competitor. Even the Odyssey, with its seductive lotus eaters and cyclops blocking harbors, reads like a merchant's manual on Mediterranean trade hazards. Polyphemus isn't merely a monster, he's the nightmare of every trader facing arbitrary port taxes, demanding his pound of flesh literally from passing ships. These myths reveal a duality ancient societies couldn't resolve. Trade was both lifeblood and existential threat. The Phoenician tale of the god Melkart sailing beyond the Pillars of Hercules mirrors real voyages to Britain for tin, but with a supernatural twist, his ship's figurehead comes alive to warn of storms. Here, commerce becomes divine trial, where only the worthy profit. Contrast that with Hindu stories of the Yakshas, forest spirits who guard treasures but curse greedy merchants who take more than their share. The message is clear: wealth from afar carries invisible moral tariffs. African oral traditions take this further. Anansi the spider, the trickster of Akan folklore, doesn't just trade goods, he trades stories themselves, haggling with the sky god Niam for the world's wisdom. It's a profound commentary on trade as cultural exchange, where the most precious cargo isn't gold but knowledge. Similarly, Inuit legends speak of Sedna, the sea goddess who withholds seals from hunters when traders break taboos, linking economic survival to environmental respect. What unites these tales is their insistence that trade was never just transactional. The Chinese legend of the cowherd and weaver girl star-crossed lovers separated by the Milky Way, allowed to meet just once a year, reflects the Silk Road's reality. Like those lovers, cultures could connect through commerce, but true understanding remained fleeting. Perhaps that's why so many myths end ambiguously. Sinbad retires wealthy but haunted, Jason wins the fleece but loses everything else, and Anansi's tricks always come with unintended consequences. These aren't happy endings, they're cautionary tales for civilizations drunk on the promise of distant riches, reminding us that the most dangerous storms aren't in the ocean, but in the human heart. High in the rose-red cliffs of southern Jordan, where the desert wind whistles through narrow canyons, lies a city carved from living rock petra. At its peak, this wasn't just a stopover for spice caravans. It was a marvel of hydraulic engineering, its temples and tombs fed by a network of terracotta pipes and cisterns that channeled every precious drop of rainwater. The Nabateans, nomadic traders turned city builders, didn't just adapt to the desert, they mastered it, taxing every frankincense-laden camel that passed through their serpentine sick. But their genius had a flaw. When Roman engineers replicated their water systems and bypassed Petra with new sea routes, the city's lifeblood, its monopoly on desert trade dried up faster than its reservoirs. Far to the northeast, where the Syrian desert meets the Fertile Crescent, the ruins of Palmyra whisper a different tale. Here, a woman named Zenobia nearly rewrote history. In the 3rd century CE, this oasis city thrived by playing Rome and Persia against each other, its merchants dealing in silks from China and pearls from the Gulf. Then Zenobia declared independence, marching her armies as far as Egypt before Rome crushed her revolt. The real tragedy wasn't military defeat, it was the salt Rome poured on Palmyra's fields, ensuring no caravan would ever revive this rebellious hub. Today, the Temple of Bel's shattered columns stand not just as victims of modern conflict, but as reminders of how quickly empires turn trade into a weapon. Across the continent, the stone towers of Great Zimbabwe rise like sentinels over the African savanna. In the 14th century, this was the epicenter of a gold network stretching to Kilwa and beyond. Archaeologists have found Chinese celadon and Persian glass in its ruins, proof of a city so rich its rulers lived in stone palaces while European kings still huddled in wooden halls. But Zimbabwe's downfall came from nature itself. Tree ring studies reveal a prolonged drought that withered the crops feeding its miners and merchants. As the gold trade shifted north to Swahili ports, the city emptied, leaving only enigmas like the soapstone birds that may have symbolized the trade winds that once brought it wealth. What unites these cities isn't just their ruins, but the patterns etched into their stones. Petra shows how infrastructure alone can't save a hub when trade routes pivot. Palmyra warns of the peril in overplaying geopolitical games, and Zimbabwe whispers the oldest lesson of all: no amount of gold can buy water from empty skies. Their ghosts linger in modern ports and financial districts, where today's trade titans would do well to remember. Every metropolis is just one drought, one shipping lane shift, or one political miscalculation away from becoming another's archaeology. In the bustling markets of ancient Babylon, merchants didn't just swear by their goods, they swore on the names of gods. Temples like the Esagila, dedicated to Marduk, weren't just places of worship. They were the original banks, their vaults overflowing with silver, grain, and contracts stamped with divine seals. Priests acted as loan officers, offering credit at interest rates blessed by the heavens, sometimes literally. A trader borrowing to fund a caravan to Anatolia might pledge his debt not just to the temple, but to the god Shamash himself, with the chilling caveat that defaulters would face the wrath of the divine. This wasn't just finance, it was commerce sanctified, where profit and piety walked hand in hand. Pilgrimages turned faith into an economic engine. The Hindu Kumbh Mela, drawing millions to the Ganges since at least the 7th century, wasn't just a spiritual gathering. It was a trade fair where Gujarati textiles met Tibetan musk and Burmese gems. Along the Camino de Santiago, medieval innkeepers grew rich, catering to pilgrims who carried not just rosaries but Flemish wool and Venetian glass to sell along the way. Even Mecca's Hajj, a pillar of Islam, doubled as the world's oldest recurring trade summit. By the 9th century, the annual pilgrimage saw caravans from Cairo to Baghdad syncing their schedules to the lunar calendar, their camels laden with books, perfumes, and legal scholars debating contracts under the stars. Religions didn't just ride trade routes, they adapted to them. Buddhism, arriving in China via Silk Road merchants, transformed serene Gandharan statues into laughing, pot-bellied milefo figures to appeal to local tastes. Christian missionaries in Ethiopia smartly rebranded their faith as a continuation of the Queen of Sheba's legacy, weaving Solomon's story into local lore. Islam's prohibition on interest birthed the Mudaraba system, where profits were shared like sacred trusts, while Jewish traders developed bills of exchange to circumvent Sabbath travel bans. a loophole that became the foundation of modern banking. The holiest sites often hid the shrewdest business minds. Delphi's oracle didn't just predict futures, she guided Greek colonists to resource-rich lands, her priests taking cuts of the ensuing trade. The Vatican's medieval Peter's Pence tax-funded wars but also built the first European postal system to collect it. And when the Khmer Empire built Angkor Wat, they didn't just carve Hindu epics into its walls. They designed its moats as part of a vast hydraulic network that turned monsoon rains into rice surpluses for export. Yet this marriage of faith and commerce wasn't always peaceful. The Crusades, framed as holy wars, were equally about wresting control of Levantine spice routes from Muslim traders. The Protestant Reformation exploded partly because German princes resented the Catholic Church's monopoly on Baltic amber sales. And when the Ming dynasty banned private ocean trade, smugglers disguised their ships as pilgrim vessels, hiding silk beneath Buddha statues, a celestial smuggling operation. What's left today are echoes in plain sight. The word salary comes from Roman soldiers paid in salt, a commodity so precious it was used in temple offerings. The handshake, a Babylonian gesture to show no dagger, was hidden during deals sworn before gods. Even modern stock markets trace their roots to Amsterdam's Calvinist merchants, who saw speculative trading as a test of divine favor. The next time you pass a church, mosque, or temple, look closer. You might just find the faded ledger of a deal struck between heaven and earth. Trade wasn't just recorded in ledgers and ship manifests. It was immortalized in brushstrokes and poetry, revealing how deeply commerce shaped the human imagination. Walk through the ruins of Pompeii's Villa of the Mysteries, and you'll find frescoes where merchants unroll bolts of Chinese silk next to amphorae of Spanish olive oil, their vibrant colors preserved by volcanic ash. These weren't mere decorations, they were boasts of wealth, advertisements for goods, and sometimes warnings. One striking panel shows a startled merchant recoiling from a Dionysian reveler, a visual parable about the dangers of greed amidst abundance. Half a world away, the cave temples of Dunhuang tell a different story. Here, Buddhist artists painted celestial beings draped in fabrics that ripple with the same patterns found in Sogdian trading posts along the Silk Road. The thousand-handed Guanyin isn't just a goddess of mercy. Her palms hold mirrors from Persia, pearls from the Indian Ocean, and scrolls bearing scripts from 5 languages. This divine inventory mirrors the real-world bazaars outside the caves, where faith and commerce blurred into one. Literature amplified these themes with even sharper detail. The Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, a 1st-century Greek sailing guide, reads like a thriller when describing the hazards of the Indian Ocean. Pirate-infested coves, monsoon winds that could snap masts like twigs, and the strange customs of distant ports where men trade silently by moonlight. Contrast that with the whimsy of the Canterbury Tales, where Chaucer's merchant character wears a Flemish beaver hat and recites profit calculations like poetry, a sly critique of Europe's rising bourgeois class. Some of the most poignant records come from unexpected sources. A Mesopotamian clay tablet from 1750 BC contains a merchant's lament scratched beside inventory lists. The copper is delayed at Canish, my creditors circle like vultures, and my wife's letters grow colder than winter barley. Even older are Egypt's satire of the trade's papyri, where scribes mock merchants as donkeys laden with luxuries, forever sniffing for profit. The irony. These insults were copied by students practicing writing on expensive papyrus paid for by those very trade profits. The messages hidden in these works range from celebration to cautionary tales. Roman mosaics in Ostia portray ships overflowing with grain as gifts from the gods. while Ming dynasty scrolls like along the river during Qingming festival subtly criticize corrupt officials skimming taxes from bridge traffic. Perhaps no work captures trade's duality better than the travels of Marco Polo. His descriptions of paper money and coal baffled medieval Europeans, yet scholars now suspect his ghostwriter embellished details to please Venetian spice investors. Even then, the line between travelogue and marketing was thin. What makes these artistic records so vital is their unfiltered humanity. Tax records tell us how much pepper crossed the Mediterranean, but it's a Pompeian graffiti that shows us a merchant's scrawled plea. May Neptune bless the Felicitas and bring her home by Saturnalia. Archaeology reveals shipwrecks laden with amphorae, but it's a Tang dynasty poem that makes us feel the homesickness of a trader watching. Wild geese fly westward as I march farther east. These creations remind us that behind every transaction was a pulse of hope, fear, or wonder, emotions as timeless as trade itself. The ghostly fingerprints of ancient trade routes press against the glass of our modern world, invisible but undeniable. Those same winds that filled the sails of Phoenician ships now power container vessels crossing the Suez Canal. Their cargo holds echoing with the same urgency as the spice-laden house of 1,000 years ago. China's Belt and Road Initiative, with its sprawling network of ports, railways, and pipelines, consciously mirrors the Silk Road's ancient blueprint right down to the diplomatic courtship of strategic way stations. When a Chinese-built port emerges in Sri Lanka or a high-speed rail line snakes through Laos, it's not just infrastructure, it's the resurrection of an old playbook where trade routes double as arteries of influence. Look closer and the parallels become even more striking. The medieval Hanseatic League system of trading posts finds its echo in Amazon's fulfillment centers, strategically planted near major transport hubs. Just as Phoenician merchants developed the alphabet to track cedar shipments, modern logistics companies rely on scannable barcodes, another form of symbolic shorthand enabling global exchange. Even the ancient practice of commodity money survives in cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, where trust in a decentralized ledger replaces faith in stamped metal. The players have changed, but the game remains eerily familiar. Yet some lessons remain unlearned. The Roman Empire's reliance on Egyptian grain foreshadowed modern supply chain vulnerabilities, like when a single grounded container ship blocked the Suez Canal in 2021, strangling global trade for weeks. The medieval spice trade's volatility, where a rumor of shipwreck could double pepper prices overnight, mirrors today's oil futures market reacting to geopolitical tremors. And when pandemic-era travel restrictions severed air freight routes, we rediscovered what the Maya knew all too well. When trade networks fracture, even advanced civilizations can face sudden shortages of essentials. Perhaps most telling are the cultural aftershocks. The Silk Road didn't just move goods, it blended philosophies, languages, and art forms into new hybrids. Today's digital marketplaces perform the same alchemy, blending K-pop with Latin rhythms, or sparking global fashion trends where Tokyo streetwear inspires designers in Milan. The medieval Islamic world's scientific renaissance, fueled by translations of Greek and Indian texts along trade routes, finds its counterpart in Silicon Valley's melting pot of global talent. History whispers warnings too. The collapse of ancient trade hubs like Palmyra or Great Zimbabwe reminds us that no center of commerce is invulnerable to climate shifts, political upheaval, or technological disruption. When Venetian merchants clung to Mediterranean spice routes while Portuguese explorers charted new ocean paths, they became cautionary tales about the perils of inflexibility, a lesson relevant to any modern industry facing disruptive innovations. The through line is clear: trade has always been about more than economics. It's about the movement of ideas in the shadow of profit, the unintended consequences of connection, and the cyclical rise and fall of gatekeepers. Those ancient merchants navigating by the stars would likely recognize today's satellite-guided cargo ships as kindred spirits, still chasing horizons, still balancing risk against reward, still binding the world together one transaction at a time. The containers may be steel now instead of ceramic, but the currents beneath them flow just as they did when the first camel caravan crested a dune with treasures from afar. The secret roads of empire were never just paths for moving goods, they were the living, breathing pulse of civilization itself. Think of them as the ancient internet, transmitting not just spices and silks but ideas, revolutions, and even plagues across continents with terrifying efficiency. Consider this, the spread of papermaking from China to Baghdad didn't just change how people wrote, it fueled the Islamic Golden Age, preserving Greek philosophy while Europe languished in its so-called Dark Ages. A single innovation carried on the backs of traders could alter the trajectory of entire civilizations, yet these connections were double-edged swords. The same Silk Road that brought Buddhism's peaceful teachings to Japan also delivered the Black Death to Europe, wiping out half the population. The Indian Ocean trade that enriched Swahili city-states also funneled enslaved people into grueling labor across the Middle East. Trade routes didn't just build bridges, they amplified both the best and worst of human nature. Take the humble peanut, domesticated in South America. It traveled to Africa via Portuguese ships, became a cash crop that sustained kingdoms, and later anchored the diets of enslaved people in the American South. One plant's journey encapsulates trade's power to nourish and exploit in equal measure. What's astonishing is how these ancient networks mirror our modern world. The Phoenicians' obsession with purple dye, a status symbol so coveted it required crushing thousands of sea snails, finds its echo in today's luxury fashion industry. The Vikings' reliance on silver to Greece trade from Constantinople to Dublin foreshadowed the rise of global currencies like the dollar. Even the collapse of these routes holds lessons. When the Maya's jade trade collapsed amid political chaos, it wasn't just an economic crisis. It shattered a cosmology where jade represented life itself. Societies don't just lose goods when trade fails, they lose part of their identity. So why does this matter now? Because every time you order a package from across the globe or sip coffee grown halfway around the world, you're walking the same invisible roads as those Silk Road merchants and Saharan salt traders. The scale has changed, but the human story remains. Our relentless drive to connect, to barter, to reach beyond the horizon. Those ancient traders braved deserts and storms not just for profit, but because curiosity and ambition are coded into our DNA. The next time you scroll through a global marketplace online, remember, you're part of a tradition as old as civilization itself, a story still being written with every click, every shipment, every exchange across borders, both real and imagined. If these echoes of the past resonate with you, join the conversation below. Which trade network's legacy surprises you most? The Silk Road's cultural alchemy, the Incense route's sacred economics, or maybe the Amber route's golden whispers? Hit like if you enjoyed this journey, subscribe to keep exploring history's hidden connections, and share your thoughts because the best trades have always been about more than goods. They're about the stories we